Welcome to Explain It Like I'm 5 Database Transactions in AL and SQL. Hey, I'm Eric. And a question that I get a lot, typically from people new to our little industry here, is the weirdness with transactions. And when I say transactions, I don't mean an invoice or a general journal or something, but a database transaction. I mean that you want to write something to the database. So in this video, we're gonna see why it's different, what's different with Business Central and AL compared to other technologies out there. Even though behind the scene everything might be SQL, because the reality is that the database that drives Business Central, even though we don't see it, it is a Microsoft SQL Server database. More specifically, it's an Azure SQL database. If you're on-prem, there is still one, but who's on-prem these days? So there is clearly a shared technology with a lot of other platforms, but in AL it's done slightly different. So let's take a look at that. And if we were in something normal, I don't know if I can say that. And let's just do some pseudo code here. Then we would say, we would say begin transaction. Then we would write invoice, and then we would go. Either we would simply say we would say end transaction. We would say commit transaction. But you would encapsulate, now we're starting touching the database, now we're done touching the database. And in between, that is where our transaction live. Illustrated here. But the reality is that that's not how it works in Business Central. Let's before we get to how it exactly works in Business Central, let's add one more twist to this tale. So we begin our transaction, we write stuff, and then error occur, right? And in a lot of places, depending on what your language is, you might end up in a construction that if error occur, then rollback transaction, else commit transaction, right? That is very much how it exists out in the not so protected world as the world of AL. So let's translate. So we have a begin transaction, we have a end or a commit transaction, and then we have the rollback scenario. So if we start looking at what can we do in AL, there is no begin transaction command. There is no. We have some functions, but there is no saying now we start. So if we have code here, so let's just create some very interesting code. Like, so I'll do this. I is equal. We do some stuff here, right? There's this code is happening, and then at some point, let's grab a table. So we grab a record. Let's just grab the sales header. At some point, we might insert a sales header record. If this is our entire code, maybe we should we be just slightly more. No, I'm not going to do init just because that will, so document type equal sales header document type colon quote, and we'll do this. So this is our entire program. So now here is the question. Is this a transaction? The answer to this is yes. The follow-up question is, where is the transaction? Where is the scope of the transaction? And in this case, here, right here, do we have the begin transaction? That is happening because now we're doing something with database. Just because we create a variable of type a record variable and we assigned field values to it, that doesn't do anything towards the database. So we do not have a transaction until we start a transaction. And how can we prove that? Well, the simple way is that there are certain things that cannot happen if we have a transaction. So let's say that we want to do a page dot run. Doesn't really matter. Page dot run. So let's do page sales quote, and we'll add our sales quote here. So now we're creating a new sales quote, and then we're opening that one. So if we try to run this piece of software now, I hit a 5 to run it. We need to log in. We got a break. So the page function failed. I just hit a 5 to continue, and then we can see here. So we get this weird error. An error occurred and the transaction is stopped. Contact your administrator or partner for further assistance. Page customer has to close. So, and then we get the Azure thing. If we want to get rid of the weird Azure try function, you go into your launch JSON and you change the break on error from all to exclude try. So what happened if we now insert into our little program here, we insert a commit. So in reality, right, we begin a transaction, we end the transaction. If I can maybe spell. So begin, insert it, end. That's the entire transaction. So if I hit a 5 on this one, we get the sales quote open that we just created. So the weird error we're getting is not very helpful. Sometimes you can get another error. I think there are certain error messages in the lifespan of the decades of existence wow, the decades of existence. For the many years that this platform has existed, there are certain error messages that keep getting a new translation, keep getting a new wording, and this is one of them. In reality, if you get the error, it's because somebody wrote some bad code. Because you want to do something, in this case, page run modal, that is not allowed to be run if there is a transaction. By committing, we're ending that transaction. In reality, we are almost starting anew. Like if we wanted to insert another one, then there's a magic new transaction starting here. So there's no transaction until you need one. and the transaction lives. So let's say get rid of this thing, and now I'll get rid of this, right? So here's our, and we'll just get rid of the lines that were only to kind of trying to prove that when this is starting. So this is our whole thing. Well, lots of stuff happened there. This is our whole thing. So now we know where the transaction starts because it starts basically here, but where does it end? And in this case, it ends when the scope of this trigger is done. Meaning that, let me try to explain what I mean by that. So we have, in this case, can I get out of this sales quote? I do not want to take the tour. So it actually opened 3 times because there is a weird bug in Business Central where sometimes the on-page trigger runs 3 times. So if I click on something, on open page happened here, right? But when the cursor is blinking and you can do stuff, then you are not typically inside a transaction. So Microsoft will commit and when this thing goes out of scope. So when this trigger is done, there is a commit after this trigger. So in cases like this, what we did is perfect, because there is a transaction, and if we were to insert, for some reason, we can do this. I'm just going to clear this one because now this sales header actually got the number of the one inserted. So if we want to use the insert true where it creates a new sales header for us, we have to make sure that the number field is blank. So now we have code that creates 3 sales quotes. If something's happened here, so I can do an error, or we can do some weird code saying I equal I divided by I, and since I is 0 at this point, this would probably fail. We can try it out. Let's see. That fails. I hit F5. Attempted to divide by 0. I have to close. So at this point, the error that occurred here triggers a rollback. It has the same effect that if I write error here, that will also trigger a rollback. So these 2 documents were never written, and of course whatever happens after the error statement is never executed. So in the beauty of the Business Central AL transaction model is that you don't really need to concern yourself about transactions in most cases. It's so somebody sent me this at some point. No, the beginner never uses commit, and then you have the one in the middle that everything, try to control everything, and then the guru at the end saying, oh, I never use commit. It's a joke, but it's also kind of true. So the question is, when should you use commit? And there are some very valid cases when you want to use commit. One is that you have to run something that will only run if there's no transaction. So if you want to run a report, you want to open a page, doing stuff like that, hey, you gotta commit before. Some cases that also leaves an opportunity to reorganize your code so you don't need the commit. In other cases, and I found a funny one actually here. I want to grab my So this is the SharePoint connector app, and I have some code here. Like here's a commit, and the reason for that is that some of the code that happens just before here will create a folder on SharePoint. So whatever happens down here, we want to make sure that the data I have inside Business Central represents the external bit. So because if an error happens and I have written a mapping record saying that we have the folder here and so on, then if an error happens that rolls back, that does not uncreate the folder in the external system. So if you do something that is not included in the rollback, if you're communicating with other things, like in this case SharePoint or anything else, you gotta sync. And in some cases you gotta get clever and saying, you may set a flag and saying this is still something, and then it is committed but it has the flag, so you can go back at some point and do something with the record with the flag. But I think that's a very valid reason. The other typical reason is that you get to some point where you need to open a page, you need to do something in the user interface that will require not being in a transaction. There is a few other cases. So let's say that you have a loop. For I equal 1 to, I don't know what number that is. What number is that? That's 1,000. That's to 100 million. That's a good number. And we create sales quotes because we need a lot of sales quote here. Maybe all these 100 million sales quotes need to either be in the system or not be. But in some cases, you might work something out. You might process data. You run through a bunch of stuff, and at some point you start building up huge transactions on the server side, and that can lead to slowdowns. So if what you do doesn't really matter, you have the option to commit. Maybe you don't commit after everyone, maybe you commit after 1,000, stuff like that. But you can end up in some weird things if you have these massive transactions. So that's something to consider. So you saw there were a couple of options here, and one thing that is interesting is the is-in write transaction. So this can be particular if you are in a situation where you are subscribing, so your code is getting triggered for something else, and there might be a case where you either do want to do something if you're in the right transaction or you're not. Last thing I want to remember to mention here is that we do have read-only triggers. So when we're on a page, we have something called a page background task, meaning that you can offload work on a page to a background task, and then when it's done, you get a trigger back, like this one. Whatever happens inside that background task is read-only. So quite often what I do is that if I need to actually do some write transaction, I encapsulate that in the result that the background task is returning, and then I perform the write transaction on this trigger, because otherwise you're outside. And there are a few of the system events that are also outside a transactional thing. So if you try to write to the database and those triggers, you'll get not possible. So in most cases, we don't care about transactions. Business Central will take care of it. It's not, you write your code and the transactions are started, they are committed. If something fails, it fails, it roll back without us thinking about it. If you issue an error, stuff will roll back. So most of the cases you're in the, hey, how do I use commit? Everything is taken care of, and you cannot write to the database without it always being part of the transaction. Check this video. There's more AL hacking going on here. Some cool stuff. I'll see you there. Take care. Bye.